Okay. Well, I think we'll get started, even if people are still drifting in. Um, so, hi everyone, and welcome to this talk that's organised by the Emergent Nonfiction Lab at the University of Salford. And very broadly, the research lab aims to explore emergent modes of nonfiction media practice and theory, and really kind of explore the ways in which documentary media, nonfiction media broadly, kind of build on violent histories of settler colonialism, racial violence, and imperialist capitalism, and also understand how modern regimes of surveillance, are really a continuation of a lot of those practices as well. And what we aim to do with the lab is to both kind of critically examine those violent foundations of kind of nonfiction media forms, whilst also shifting our focus towards emerging modes of counter theory and practice. So, with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Petra Molnar. Petra is a lawyer and anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights. She is the co creator of the Migration and Technology Monitor, a collective of civil society journalists, academics, and filmmakers interrogating technological experiments on people crossing borders. She is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University and a Faculty Associate and former Fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Petra has crossed many borders and worked all over the world, including Jordan, Turkey, the Philippines, Kenya, Colombia, Canada, and various parts of Europe. Petra's work has appeared in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, Wired, The Guardian, and many other outlets. Her first book, The Wall Have Eyes: Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, was published this year with the New Press. I'm just going to admit those waiting. And it's this book that's the subject of today's talk and discussion. So, based on years of researching borderlands across the world, The Walls Have Eyes is a truly global story, a dystopian vision turned reality, where your body is your passport and matters of life and death are determined by algorithm. Examining how technology is being deployed by governments on the world's most vulnerable with little regulation, Molnar also shows us how borders are now big business, with defense contractors and tech startups alike scrambling to capture this highly profitable market. The Walls Have Eyes reveals the profound human stakes of the sharpening of borders around the globe, foregrounding the stories of people on the move and the daring forms of resistance that have emerged against the hubris and cruelty of those seeking to use technology to turn human beings into problems to be solved. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to Petra, who will speak for, I think, around half an hour to 40 minutes. So, Petra, please, thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. What a generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. Early August, I'm sure we have many other things to do than talk about border tech, but I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me today and for the opportunity to share a little bit about some of the work that I have been doing over the last 6 years, trying to understand how new technologies are interacting with border management regimes. So indeed, as Patrick said, I have some brief ideas and thoughts to share with you for about half an hour, but then I want to make sure that we have enough time to chat and learn from one another in the room as well. And I also have images to show to illustrate some of the points that I make, because I find that sometimes when talking about surveillance and technology, they can be very abstract concepts, and it's always good to ground ourselves in the present grounded reality for people on the move. So as Patrick already said, I'm a lawyer and an anthropologist by training, and I have spent the last 6 years trying to understand how new technologies of border management, so things like surveillance, automated decision-making, and various other experimental projects that I will touch on, how they are playing out in migration control. And I've always worked from a comparative perspective. And this project organically grew from my work in this area in Canada in 2018, when we published a report with a citizen lab looking at automated decision-making in Canada's immigration system. Back then, I barely knew what an algorithm was. I am not a technologist by training. I am trained in refugee law, in human rights, in social anthropology and ethnographic methods, but not tech per se. But I became concerned because technology is ultimately about power, and power differentials are so inherent in the way that borders are managed and the way that people experience them. And so after Canada, I started to try and stitch together this global story, going to the fringes of Europe, to East Africa, to the U.S. Mexico border, to the occupied Palestinian territories, and other zones as well, where this experimentation is taking place. But I'll put my ethnographic hat on for just a second and speak a little bit about some of the methodology around why some stories are the ones that made it into the book, and how I try and kind of work within this complex system of storytelling and knowledge extraction from these spaces as well. Because for me, as someone who's been really privileged to work closely and directly with people on the move for a number of years, and to also have the opportunity to steward some of their stories that have made it into the book, I think it's very important to kind of pay attention to what brings us to the work, and how we choose to tell the stories that we do. Because it is ultimately a global story of power and violence and innovation and contestation too. And in my way of working, I try and sometimes bridge this somewhat uneasy gap between law and anthropology. For me, it's been a slow and a trauma-informed ethnographic methodology that required years of being present in certain spaces to at least try and begin unraveling some of these complexities of story and memory, power and privilege that make up the very complex realities in which people's lives unfold. And for other ethnographers in the room, I'm sure this maybe will hit close to home, but these practices also don't yield immediate insights, and actually sometimes we face scrutiny for the length of time and the repeat visits that make up this kind of corpus of work. But for me, it ultimately is about the relational building of knowledge that is kind of at the center of all of this, and this slow unpicking of the real impacts of border violence and border technologies. And like for many of us in the room, much of this work is also deeply personal. I have my own migration and multi-hyphenated identity to contend with as I move through the world, and also now occupy a position of privilege as a practical academic, a lawyer and researcher and storyteller. Because ultimately, research and storytelling is a deeply political act, and one that I think all of us need to examine critically in a constant way, and towards a recommitment around these kind of questions that we ask. Because it ultimately is about some of these broader questions. The technology for me is a way to try and understand how power operates, but it's also about who gets to participate in innovation, and why certain communities, often the ones on the margins, become testing grounds for high-risk experimentation. It is also about representation, and I won't go into this too much, but I do think it's interesting some of the kind of visual choices, or even the storytelling choices that are made in this space, that have rightly been critiqued as quote unquote poverty porn. You'll notice that a lot of the photos that I show are mostly of infrastructure, or they don't show people's faces. Oftentimes, even on UN reports and in academic writing, we see these photos of racialized bodies in deep distress. And this is something that my team and I do not intend to perpetuate. We work directly with colleagues on the move, and I will end with that at the end of my presentation. But I think it's very important to pay attention to the kind of images that we select, and ensure that we don't freeze people in a state of trauma and oftentimes, the worst moment of their lives, just so that they can be on a report or an academic article. So those are just some of the kind of broader reflections that I wanted to start off with. But ultimately, the starting premise is that borders are violent spaces. They have been violent for decades, since the inception of the border as a concept. But these violent global policies are now sharpened through the use of digital technologies that are developed for the purposes of border control and migration management. And as we'll see together, these technologies have real life impacts. They separate families, they push people into life-threatening terrain, and exacerbate historical and systemic discrimination that is already a daily reality for people on the move. And what I've seen time and again across all these different contexts is that borders are a testing ground. They are places where regulation and oversight is already deliberately limited, and where this kind of frontier attitude informs the development and deployment of technology at the expense of people's lives. Because at every point of a person's migration journey now, they are impacted by high-risk, unregulated technology. Before they even move, at the border and in refugee camps, and even after they've entered a third space, there's digital technologies and automation and surveillance that impacts every single step along this journey. But I want to take you first to the U.S. Mexico border, because again, this is one of the spaces that I found quite fascinating because you can actually see a lot of this infrastructure firsthand. As you can imagine, trying to photograph a drone or a discriminatory algorithm is very difficult. But at the U.S. Mexico border, you can actually drive up to some of these fixed AI surveillance towers. Surveillance towers that I should also mention are from an Israeli company called Elbit Systems, which also tests out surveillance technologies on Palestinians and then exports this technology into the world for border enforcement practices. And again, the context matters here, right? Because when we're trying to understand the impacts of these different migration management technologies, again, the broader ecosystem in which they are developed is really, really important. And this is an ecosystem that's replete with criminalization of migration, apartheid technologies, anti-migrant sentiments, and also violent practices like pushbacks that are becoming very common across the world's borders. So the first time that I was in the Sonora Desert in Arizona was spring of 2022. And I was there to see the impacts of the surveillance firsthand. And I was working closely with a search and rescue group that goes into the desert to do water drops and to look for people who are in distress and oftentimes finding human remains of people who have been crossing. But while I was on the sands of the Sonora, I had an extremely surreal moment, probably one of the most surreal ones in my career. And if you choose to read the book, you'll see that there are many such moments. But that week that we were in the Sonora Desert in February of 2022, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they are now wanting to use our robodogs to augment this kind of migration management arsenal. These quadruped military-grade pieces of technology that you might see running around in an episode of Black Mirror or other types of sci-fi shows. So this is disturbing and quite visceral, I think, for a lot of us to consider a robodog being out there. But again, the future is not just more technology. Unfortunately, in these contexts, it's also more death. Thousands of people have already perished making these kind of dangerous crossings, including Mr. Alias Alvarado, who was a young husband and father from Central America, whose memorial site I visited with Battalion Search and Rescue, the search and rescue group that you see here. Unfortunately, Mr. Alvarado, who was in search of a better life, succumbed mere kilometers away from a major highway in the Sonora Desert. Thing is, states like to say that smart borders and AI and surveillance are going to strengthen borders and deter people from coming. But that's not actually what happens in reality. Instead, people are forced to take more dangerous routes towards less inhabited terrain, leading to increased loss of life, not only at the U.S. Mexico border, as we're seeing here, but also along the maritime borders of the European Union. And I find it particularly disturbing that in the not so distant future, will people like Mr. Alvarado be pursued by robodogs, military-grade, high-speed machines designed for these purposes? I always also like to show this photo as a little reminder of how arbitrary borders really are. So this is, of course, the infamous Trump wall. You know, it is hulking, it is huge, it is rusty. You can drive up to it, you can touch it, and the rust will stay in your hand for the rest of the day as kind of a physical reminder of its colossal nature. It runs along the El Camino del Diablo that you see there, the Devil's Highway, but it also just ends. And that hill there, you can climb up there and kind of pop your head over to the other side. If that's not a reminder of the arbitrariness of borders, I don't know what is. I want to preface the next photo by just saying it's not the easiest to look at, but I think it's an important one. In the summer of 2020, I found myself in Greece, thinking, as many ethnographers do, that I would be there for a month or two doing some deep research, and then I would go back to Canada. And I, in fact, stayed for nearly 3 years. Greece is one of the areas where so much border violence happens, and it is also a testing ground for surveillance technology. And the region of Evros that separates Greece and Turkey is one of these sites. And almost as a pilgrimage, when I'm in the region, I try and make this drive down to Sidero, which is a small village in Evros. It's actually very beautiful. It's flanked by these golden poplar trees. And outside a small village lies a cemetery of largely unmarked graves. It's kind of final resting place of people on the move who've died making their journey to Europe. You'll notice that the majority of the graves are unmarked, but some do have inscriptions that were sent to the local imam by the family members of those who died, painstakingly carved into the raw marble by hand. And when I was there, I saw a relatively fresh grave of a young woman who passed away only 8 months before my visit. She was born in 1993, and she was from Syria. And there were still decayed roses on top of her grave, perhaps as an act of recognition or an act of care from some of the villagers. But while I was kneeling down, paying my respect, something caught my eye, something green and putrid. These standing water holes, which have been chewed out of the earth, 3 open graves waiting. So this is the region where experimental new surveillance technology is being deployed. Not only different aerostat machines and drones, also a sound cannon that was announced a few years ago, different types of predictive analytics, surveillance cameras, all the while people continue to die. The other class of technologies I want to just briefly touch on is carceral type technologies. What you're looking at is a refugee camp. This is on the island of Kos, one of the 5 so-called hotspots in the Aegean that have been housing people in great numbers since 2015, 2016, and are now part of this kind of virtual fortress Europe, so to speak, that has been on the rise for the last couple of years. Interestingly enough, Kos is also one of the sites of an EU-funded project called RoBorder, which, and this is a direct quote, aims to create a fully functional autonomous border surveillance system with unmanned mobile robots, including aerial, water surface, underwater, and ground vehicles. However, I would urge you to think about where these resources would be better spent instead of on surveillance technology. The island of Samos, similar to Kos, is the site perhaps where most of this carceral tech got started. And I was there for the opening of the first camp out of 5 back in September of 2021. And I was actually just on Samos last weekend to see what's been happening. So Samos is the home of this multi-purpose reception and identification center that is replete with all sorts of high-tech interventions, biometrics, at one point even virtual reality glasses that were going to be rolled out for the camp guards to wear. But it's important to note that 2 weeks before opening, the Samos camp did not have running water. So on the eve of essentially what was a forcible transfer of people who were in a very squalid condition camp inside the main city of Samos, they were basically facing a forcible transfer to this new prison-like camp. I spent some time with a young mom who was facing this transfer, and she quickly typed out this message so that my colleagues could also understand who were with us. And she says, if we go there, we will go crazy. But again, if this is what the camp looks like, we can imagine why she would say that. So zooming out a bit from the ground, I want to just present some human rights impacts that are important to think about. And I mean, we could spend an entire day together talking about the ways that these technologies are impacting real people, whether we're looking at, freedom of association and religion, if social media is being scraped to create risk profiles on people before they even move. Freedom of movement, of course, including the non-refoulement principle, which is a foundational principle under international refugee law that says that you're not allowed to be returned to a country where you might face persecution. This is obviously impacted if we're using surveillance technology, including predictive analytics, to push people away from European territory and towards danger. Of course, life, liberty, and security of the person, whether that is carceral technologies in camps, or the deaths that are being experienced in the Mediterranean and Aegean or along the U.S. Mexico border. But I want to focus on just 2 rights pretty briefly. Privacy rights and data protection are hugely important to think about in this area, because of course we're talking about extremely sensitive data that people have to give sometimes. We're talking about biometrics in refugee camps. That is something that happens quite a lot now. People oftentimes have to give their iris scanning and fingerprinting in exchange for weekly food rations in refugee camps like Azraq in Jordan. But when you actually spend time talking with people, people say they're very uncomfortable to have their irises scanned. But if you don't have your irises scanned, you don't eat that week. It also makes us think about the concept of informed consent, let alone where this data is going. And there have been some significant data breaches already, including by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that collected huge amounts of data on Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and then inadvertently shared this data with the Myanmar government, the very government that the refugees were fleeing from. Equality and freedom from discrimination, of course, extremely important. We already know that there's so much discretion in the way that decisions get made at the border. So many decisions are also motivated by systemic racism, policies of exclusion. And we also know that there are vast inaccuracies in terms of how a lot of this technology works and how it exacerbates systemic racism. It also makes me think about some of these really problematic projects that I've been alluding to, including the border control project, which was a pilot project under Horizon 2020 that tried to create essentially an AI-type lie detector based on facial recognition and microexpression analysis. I mean, from a refugee law perspective, this is pretty shocking, right? Because we know that human decision makers struggle with not making discriminatory determinations about how a person is supposed to act, not only at the border, but also in a refugee hearing, for example. When I used to practice law in Canada, I remember dealing with judges that would make very problematic assumptions about a person's truthfulness or plausibility of their story based on the fact that sometimes they weren't making eye contact. Well, if we think about it, why might a person not make eye contact, right? Maybe they're uncomfortable making eye contact with the judge of the opposite gender because of their religion, because of their experiences, maybe because they're nervous. Or what about the impact of trauma on memory and the fact that we know that we don't tell stories in a linear way anyway? The human decision makers struggle with this. How can an AI lie detector deal with the complexities of human life? But of course, it is about these bigger ideas, right? I mean, we know that these technologies are already in development and the sheer scale of impact is extraordinary. The risks, as I hope I'm illustrating for you, are very real. And again, the context of immigration law and decision-making at the border is very important because, again, we're dealing with very, very discretionary decisions with oftentimes weak safeguards and oversight. And there's also this nexus between national security, which means even weaker oversight. This is something that we're seeing now with the European Union's AI Act that could have been a very strong way to set some global standards on AI technology at the border. But again, as soon as something is determined to be national security, a lot of these safeguards that are already pretty limited go out the window. And again, this kind of AI hype, this techno-solutionism is very, very in vogue, I would say now, but it is just simply inappropriate to try and get at the complexities of something as nuanced as human migration. And just, I want to zoom out for a bit even further, because ultimately, the technology, again, is a lens through which to understand power. When and why have we decided that these are the appropriate tools to even use, right? Particularly without adequate governance and accountability mechanisms in place for when things go wrong. And again, immigration decision-making and border decision-making is already opaque, discretionary, and hard to understand. Many of us, I'm sure, in the room have had these experiences at the border as well. And there have already been drastic results. I can think of one case in particular that to me is quite telling. 7,000 students were deported wrongfully out of the UK as a result of a language acquisition algorithm that accused them of cheating on a language acquisition test. And this to me is really, really troubling. So this algorithm made a mistake and accused students of cheating on a test. Your entire life is turned upside down by this decision. But what do you do about this if you are one of these students and you want to appeal? Where does responsibility and liability lie here? Is it with the designer of the technology, person who codes it? Is it with the immigration officer who uses it? Is it with the algorithm itself? Should an algorithm have legal personality in a court of law? I mean, again, these questions are a bit far-fetched, but I think that it's important to ask them because this is now the kind of next vanguard of human rights litigation that we're going to be see jurisdiction after jurisdiction. But to me, again, it's about these broader logics that underpin why this technology is allowed to proliferate in the way that it does. And if I had to sum up, again, the last 6 years of this work, I think it would actually be this. The lack of global governance is not accidental. It actually is deliberate because it allows for this creation of these opaque zones of technological experimentation that would not be allowed to occur in other spaces. And again, this is underpinned by logics of exclusion. Mobile populations like refugees, people on the move, stateless persons are this abject or feared other, therefore justifying unregulated technological experimentation under the guise of efficiency and security. And powerful global North states in particular justify this experimentation through this kind of permanent vigilance, activity, and intervention. Once again, concentrating the locus of power in North America and Europe to be deployed on the rest of the world to prevent the so-called unwanted others from coming. I mean, even the whole rhetoric of migration management, right, implies that refugees and people on the move must be controlled, made intelligible or trackable because they're a threat, not only a threat to national sovereignty and a way of life, but also in terms of this kind of fracturing world that we are in. And this spectacle, this performance of state sovereignty, of surveillance, of keeping people away, it is this theater that we are seeing playing out in these contexts, whether it's a securitized refugee camp or a border zone full of drones. Again, it is to signal a particular message of who belongs and who does not. And ultimately, again, it is underpinned, all of this, by systemic racism and historical discrimination against people who are migrating, right? And technology reifies these differences. But I think what's quite interesting too here, right, is that none of this actually stays at the border anymore. So those robo-dogs that I mentioned at the U.S. Mexico corridor that were announced in February of 2022, well, just a year later, I think it was May 2023, the New York City Police Department proudly announced that they wanted to deploy a fleet of robots to, quote, help keep New York safe. One even painted white with black spots on it like a Dalmatian. So ultimately, right, this is about technology, but again, it's about broader questions. How have we allowed for something like this to happen? Which communities get to participate in conversations around proposed innovation? And again, why are some communities testing grounds for technology that is then rolled out in broader aspects? And I want to single out some actors in particular, one being the private sector, because the private sector gets to determine again and again on what we innovate on and why, in often very problematic public-private partnerships, right, where states require a private sector actor to help them develop and deploy this technology. And we see this kind of normative power of the private sector in the way that these technologies are thought about. I mean, if the problem to be solved, quote unquote, is migration, and private sector companies are making massive amounts of money now in what has been called the border industrial complex, now estimated to be about 70 billion US dollars, it makes sense, right? Why private companies would say, well, you know what you need to the quote unquote problem of migration? You need a robodog, you need a drone, you need biometrics, you need solutions to this complex issue. And again, if the bottom line for the private sector is to make money and there's not regulation, there's no incentive to create guardrails or governance mechanisms for this. But what I find so sad, really, is that there's a lot of hubris, right, on part of big tech, and this kind of allure of quick fixes and technological solutions that are not at all actually even interested in addressing the systemic reasons of why people are forced to move in the first place. And it is about these broader priorities, right? Which priorities take precedence? Why are we developing violent sound cannons, AI lie detectors, and robodogs instead of using AI to root out racist border guards or to audit immigration decisions, right? That is a clear choice. And again, the lack of global governance and even oversight and accountability around so much of this is extremely convenient because it allows for this kind of perfect laboratory of high-risk experimentation to occur. So that's really depressing. And I normally sometimes end my talks there, but I actually want to just take the next couple minutes to look forward a little bit and present some ideas about how we can build a different world. And if you will permit me, I will share with you a little bit about our project called the Migration and Technology Monitor. So we first started this in 2020 along with Professor Tindai Achiume. And it was going to be kind of an observatory or a platform to hold some of this work on border surveillance, but then it quickly grew into a community. And last year, for the first time, we started a fellowship program for colleagues on the move, people in different levels of displacement, to tell their own stories on border surveillance. And we have been incubating 5 fellows last year and 5 fellows this year who get paid a living wage to be with us for a year, to work on what has been determined to be important by their communities. And it's been really fascinating because, some projects are perhaps more in line with what I work on, kind of some of the sharpest edges of surveillance and how migrant workers, for example, are facing surveillance in the Middle East. That's being done by Rajendra Paudel, who is a former migrant worker himself. While Kharsifi is a Syrian journalist who's been looking at surveillance in Malaysia, where he was stateless for many years, and now in the European Union. Veronica Martinez has been looking at the use of facial recognition technology, including the CBP-1 facial recognition application that was rolled out at the U.S. Mexico border, but also technologies that actually can be designed for and by mobile populations themselves. Neri Santaella, in particular, is an expert on chatbots, and she's a Venezuelan refugee. She has been working with her own community to develop these tools that are actually accessible to people on the move from her homeland. And Simon Drotti, who is my colleague in Uganda, he is a data analyst and a refugee who lives in a refugee camp along the border and has been working on technologies of psychosocial support, including an archival methodology that he's using for his own community to create an application called the Memory Scroll, which I find really interesting and quite moving. And I think the thing that we try to do with the Migration and Technology Monitor is not only to seed space and make space for people on the move to become experts and also to have their expertise recognized in these spaces. It is also about these broader questions about knowledge production and who gets to take up space to tell the stories that need to be told. And we are lucky because this year we're running our second fellowship and we're working with colleagues in Palestine, in South Africa, Mexico, Uganda. And it's been really, really wonderful to grow this kind of community organically. So I'm happy to talk about that too for those of you in the room who are interested in more participatory type methodologies. We're hoping to expand into other areas this year in particular, including spyware and cybersecurity, because the Refugee Law Lab was a victim of a cyber attack actually a few months ago and we lost everything on our website. So that really brought home the point of needing to upskill ourselves as well on these elements of technology too. And for those of you who might be interested, and thank you, Patrick, for already mentioning this and for inviting me to talk a little bit about this. Much of what I've told you today is in my first book called The Walls of Eyes. It just came out in May, in Europe, actually, beginning of July. And if you're interested, do pick it up. It should be available everywhere books are sold, hopefully a small local bookshop, but I do think it's also on Amazon. So thank you so much for listening and for the opportunity to share a bit about this work. And I look forward to the Q&A that we're about to have together. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Petra. That was great. If anyone's got questions, feel free to type them in the chat or to raise your hand as well. Perhaps as people are sort of thinking about questions and having thoughts, I could jump in with something to start. So I guess one of the things I'm really interested in is the way the book kind of really resists the tendency, I guess, that we've seen around the kind of spectacularization of the border. I think you mentioned this as well. And I don't know, to me, it's like this tendency seems to be kind of like twofold. Firstly, this kind of spectacularization is produced by those who insist on the need for kind of tighter border controls, right? So state actors, private contractors, etc., who are invested in this as a industry, and they kind of, where the kind of presumed illegality of migration is kind of made spectacularly visible, and a criminalized and racialized portrayal of migration is produced. Then secondly, I think many researchers and journalists as well end up kind of knowingly or unknowingly replicating such a spectacularization through the kind of what you describe in your talk as the kind of fetishization of human suffering as well. So I'm interested in you touched on this briefly, but the way in which your book seeks to kind of like break from that kind of pattern of examining the border, and particularly the kind of the trauma-informed ethnographic methodology that you kind of deploy with the book. And perhaps for those who haven't kind of read the entire book at this point, I was just wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit more about that approach and what it does to kind of resist that spectacularization of the border as well.
Sure, would be happy to. And this is such an important element to how I try and move through the world. And I'm really glad that you asked this question. I think part of it is this commitment to having an iterative methodology that also just takes a long time. I had the luxury of time, and I don't mean that lightly. I think that is something really precious, because I've worked very closely with journalists, for example, or other researchers who are working on a much shorter timeline. Not that that excuses fetishization or extractivism ever, but I do maybe understand sometimes where it comes from, where you're in a conflict zone or one of these difficult areas and you feel like, oh my God, I have a one-shot chance at this, right? And I've seen people make some really problematic choices about just not thinking about how even their line of questioning is making someone feel. Again, for me, the luxury came with being able to build relationships with people and visiting multiple times. I mean, the island of Samos alone, I think I went to 8 or 10 times. It's, and also living in Greece and being able to be there for a number of years really, really helped with those elements. And, I definitely don't think it's perfect. There's always better ways that we can be working, but ultimately I think it's centering the person that we are trying to understand and also learn from. And perhaps also going in with not so many presuppositions in terms of what you want to see. I think allowing the kind of conversations to really unfold in a way that they will. But again, this is a luxury perhaps of a more ethnographic approach. I mean, I think if I had other colleagues with me, they would be like, what are you doing? This is not an interview. You're just having lunch with someone in their refugee container for like 5 hours, And sometimes I don't even ask a lot of questions. I just sit and witness. But again, when you're able to do that again and again, it actually does bring up a lot of complexity. And the last thing I will say too, and maybe this will sound a bit strange coming from a lawyer, although I'm a reluctant lawyer. For me, the goal is not accuracy per se, but it is more the complexity of the stories. And you make choices as a result of that. I very rarely record my interviews, for example, because I find the power differential is so stark when you sit at a table and you go, plonk, here is now my recorder. For those of you who do media in the room, I'm sure you know what I mean, because as soon as that camera is on, as soon as there's a mic in your face, like even with years and years of media training, right? Like I still freeze up a bit. Imagine if there's already a massive power differential, right, between the person that I'm speaking with and myself. That can rightly be critiqued for not being accurate enough. But I think for me, in terms of the balancing that I'm trying to do, I will always choose to be on the side of working from a more trauma-centered perspective and allowing conversations to kind of unfold the way they are.
Great, thanks so much for that. So we've got a couple of questions from the room. So Samarth, if you please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
So my question is, to what extent do you think are these technologies working as intended? And so even, especially with experimental AI technologies, even under like lab conditions, they don't give you 100% accuracy. Might do like 60%, right? Which is like half the time they're getting things wrong. So to what, and then you go in the field and it's typically worse, right? So to what extent are they doing the intended thing? And when they're not, does anybody care? And that with the caveat that the intended thing might also not be the right thing, but still.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Samarth. I think that's, I tried to I glossed over this a little bit, but it's such an important question because you're absolutely right. A lot of the times the technology doesn't do what it's intended. It doesn't even work. Sometimes it's difficult to even know what the parameters of what was being proposed actually happens on the ground. Greece is a great example of this, right? When those camps were first announced and when we first saw them, they seemed extremely high tech, this kind of biometric, VR glasses for the guards, drones, stuff like that. I mean, some of this definitely happens and people talk about it, but it's nowhere near this kind of level, right, of high tech stuff that first appeared in the press releases and the conversations by the officials. So it is really fascinating, right? Because then it actually becomes about the performance or the spectacle of technology rather than its actual efficacy. And even, the technologies that actually do work, quote unquote, right? Like the AI towers at the U.S. Mexico border. They're around, you can drive up to them, you can see them, there's a bunch there. I mean, people circumnavigate them all the time anyways. I literally saw this with my own 2 eyes when I was there for a book talk in May of this year. I went down to the border with my friend Todd Miller, whose work is fantastic. I would encourage you to take a look at it. He's been working on, border surveillance issues in Arizona in particular for many years. We went down to see the border and see what's changed. There's some new smart track, blah, 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 that they're introducing. And we literally, with our own 2 eyes, saw a person scale the wall, jump down underneath a surveillance tower, shake himself off, and then run off into the neighborhood, right? So even the tech that actually, quote unquote, does work doesn't actually accomplish its purpose. And then we have to ask some complicated questions, like what is really the goal here, right? And part of it is this spectacle. It is this performance of sovereignty, performance of surveillance, performance of tech, and kind of leveraging this AI moment, right? Like this AI hype, right? AI arms race, people have called it. I mean, hey, you know what? I'll call myself out too. I added AI to the cover of my book because it's a sexy topic, right? So we are all kind of somehow complicit in this like AI obsession, but oftentimes it's like not even AI that's at the border. Anyway, I could go on, but thank you for that question. I thought that was, a really, really important point to bring up.
Thank you.
Liam, please.
Thanks so much. Thank you for the talk. It's super interesting. My question is it was a good jumping off point what you said about the AI hype. My question is about donors and international, especially governmental donors, USAID and the European Commission, and kind of the way that they incentivize organizations, NGOs, UN agencies to provide these tech solutions. I think the AI hype kind of permeates all over the kind of the thought, the discourse that they're kind of seeped in, and I'm kind of wondering about what you came across in your research and how kind of techno solutionism is the face of everything, and everyone wants a technical solution for migration, but also more broadly the way that donors kind of push tech solutions within ID systems in developing countries and things like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it kind of makes me think of, again, the kind of following the money line of work, right? And not, of course, the private sector is a major element, but for sure, I mean, donors like European Commission, also international organizations, right, that are implementing a lot of this are absolutely complicit. Makes me think a lot about border externalization choices as well, where we have Europe paying, right, countries in Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa to do the dirty work of the European Union, right, through technology, through trainings, preventing people from even being able to leave the African continent, right, because that's ultimately what Europe wants to do, to externalize its borders to such an extent that people won't even be able to come in the first place. And absolutely, thanks for bringing up the identity issue, for sure. I have a chapter on stuff like that in the book, but it is yet another kind of gloss to this, right? This kind of digital colonialism and this obsession with identity, which again, on one hand is important because we have so many people who are stateless and without the ability to be fully present in society, right? But then we see this again turn to techno-solutionism and like ID for D and other types of projects that the World Bank funds. We have to ask why. Like, what is this really about? Is it about data? Is it about farming massive amounts of data, which are then shared with the West? And yet again, kind of these logics of exclusion. And just, I think with international organizations more broadly too, I mean, I alluded to it a little bit, but they're also a major driver in the kind of normative power behind technology. They're often the ones that, roll out biometrics in refugee camps first and say, hey, this is great because we need more effective and efficient ways to disperse humanitarian aid. Like, yeah, okay, sure, that's a worthy goal, but what else is this doing, right? And why is more data always better? And who can opt out of these data collection systems? I think international organizations in particular are an area where we all need to do just a lot more work on when it comes to tech, because they're also this third actor, right? In terms of regulation, they're not a state, they're not a private sector actor. How do we regulate an international organization? I feel like every single one now has some statement on AI of like ethical principles. And I'm not dumping on ethics. I mean, ethics are really important, but they're also not enforceable. So what do we do about that, right? They're a major player in all of this too.
I just have a very quick follow-up. Do you think there's also an advocacy opportunity in the governmental actors? Because, there can be FOIA requests, there can be kind of, more so than like you're saying, the unaccountable third actors, the governments theoretically should be a bit more accountable.
Yeah, I mean, I think theoretically, definitely. But in my experience, yeah, there's all sorts of obfuscation that can happen, even with FOIA requests, of course. And then I'm sure to many of you in the room who do this work too, all of a sudden, they'll release stuff to you, but it will be redacted, 97% or whatever. So there is this kind of performance of like playing nice as well, I think. But I think you're right. In a way, there are more ways that we can try and get at the kind of reality of the situation that is much more difficult with an international organization too. But then it's tricky too, because it's like there are obviously outfits within, like the UN system, for example, that have tried to take a really strong stance on things, and I think that's a good thing. But it's also not enforceable, right? And I know, like someone who works in international law, it's important to critique this, right? Because at the end of the day, yet another UN statement or a UN report, which I also co-author, right? It's like, what is that going to do? It's out there and it says, well, we need a moratorium or a ban on border tech. Great. Off into the ether it goes, right? And it doesn't actually result in anything. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer to this really.
Thanks so much, Liam, for your question. Josh, please.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. It was really fascinating and important. I had two questions. They're sort of the same, so do what you want with them. One was sort of a methodological, and when you talk about sort of trauma-centered and trauma-informed ethnography, I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about some of like the key points or methodological approaches that shape that trauma-informed piece, especially given so much increasing prominence of and changes in both sort of popular and academic discourses about trauma pretty generally. So for you, what are you finding is both really sort of central and important, especially ethically, around your idea and your concept of trauma-informed ethnography? And the second piece, I was really curious, in addition to sort of technological failures that first question brought up, did you notice or have you noticed either interesting examples or trends of sort of counter technologies, either sort of actively subverting the uses of some of those technologies that you've been talking with us today, or using other technologies to sort of jam them, use them differently. So I'm curious about sort of other counter technological practices that you might have come up with in your research. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Okay, so the first question about trauma, yeah, it's something I think that needs to be critiqued as well. And even the context or the subject matter of trauma is of course not without its pitfalls, right? And I've seen this too, where sometimes it seems to be kind of glossed or slapped on a particular methodology without actually thinking about how we do the kind of praxis or kind of iterative way of working with it, kind of from the ground up. I mean, for me, I employ some tools and techniques that I was trained with when I was a practicing lawyer in Canada. And I've kind of adapted some of them to some of this more ethnographic way of working on the ground. Even something as simple as kind of not going in, with a set of 10 or 20 questions, right? And I see this sometimes difference with some of my grad students who are doing really amazing work, and they're like, okay, I'm going to go and ask this person these 20 questions. And I'm like, yeah, but what if that's just not how the conversation is going to go, right? We need to have some space for silence and for the person that we're interacting with to actually lead the conversation. I mean, there's also different kind of narrative tools, right, that we can lean on or use. Or one example that I always like to give is how we end a conversation too. This is something that was kind of hammered home for me many times, where, I think it's our responsibility to not leave the person worse off than they were before they started talking to us, right? The kind of do no harm principle, so to speak. And that can be done really simply by, not ending the conversation on the most kind of traumatic part, when you're talking to a survivor of pushbacks, which again, I see sometimes with journalists, right? Like they got to have their 5 questions and like, what happened to you? This is terrible. Tell me more about the violence, which again, is important from an evidentiary perspective, but how do we leave that person off when we kind of sign off, so to speak, right? And that can be done in simple ways, whether redirecting the conversation towards what they're making for dinner, or how their children are, and things like this. It sounds really simple, but actually I think all of these kind of small ways of showing up for one another can make a massive difference in the kind of relational way of working as well. And again, I'll just bring it back to my earlier points. I think in a way I have a lot of privilege, right? Because the way I work is relational, and I oftentimes don't have just one conversation with someone, but it is a series of conversations spread out over time often, that I think also allows you to grow a relationship in a different way, which could be critiqued as getting too close to your research subject. There's the other side to it too, and it is this kind of constant balance. But that's kind of how I try and work in those perspectives. And then about your question, which I think is a really good point, the kind of contestation of technology and co-optation. So I'm working on my second book, and it's going to be actually on this, how we can resist technologies. And again, these kind of even just these extractive ways that research in this space is done, but like what are people actually doing? I mean, there's drone jamming technology that people are developing. There is different sweaters that people have been knitting to obfuscate like facial recognition and biometric technology if you're walking down the street. There's even like anti-facial recognition makeup that people have developed. But people on the move themselves also are part of the way that technologies are being resisted or even co-opted. A simple example that comes to mind is even the way that, for example, people on the move use TikTok or migrant talk. If you look up the hashtag, you will see really interesting stuff, like people, doing a little selfie video in the middle of the Mediterranean, sharing their experience and kind of creating almost like a digital record of all of this. I think that is interesting too. I mean, human smugglers or facilitators also use these platforms to sell their services. So there's kind of, a dark side to it too, but it is kind of fascinating how even just communication technologies and even something, as interesting as TikTok, right, is being kind of co-opted in these spaces. So definitely, I would also say stay tuned. I'll see what I discover for this second book.
Thanks, Josh, for the question. If maybe, if people are thinking of other questions, if anybody else wants to just raise your hand, maybe I'll jump in with a quick question myself. And I think, like in the introduction to the book, I was really struck by the kind of the argument you made around how, in fact, the kind of the abuse you write a quote that the abuse of technology is a leveler, encouraging us to move away from rigid binaries between migrants and everyone else. And it seems like I don't know, really like a powerful idea to try and cultivate spaces of solidarity from actually within this kind of like contemporary technological dystopia, right? Like, so it's I don't know, it almost reminds me of that, the IWW motto, an injury to one is an injury to all, right? I was just wondering if maybe you could unpack that a little bit more, like how perhaps spaces of solidarity can actually emerge from these kind of like seemingly kind of like totalizing and abusive systems in the way in which they actually create much more of a kind of like a level playing field in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about this kind of almost cross-pollination of ideas and seeing the interconnectedness in all of this. And you know, for me, the technology, again, was a lens through which to try and at least unpack or begin to unpack some of the ways that this is all connected. Also, you know, with environmental activism, for example, right? Or indigenous land rights activism that is rubbing up against border surveillance. This is something that happens in Arizona, for example, where a lot of the Elbit Systems towers are placed on Tohono O'odham land. And that was a huge point of contention for the Tohono O'odham community, because some band members wanted the towers there because the company had said, well, we're going to support your land rights claims. And others said, no, in solidarity with our, you know, people on the move who are crossing our lands, like, we don't want this on our ancestral land. So it is interesting because there is a lot of, I think there's a lot of coming together that can happen in these space to then, like you say, counter the kind of totalizing narrative and also this hopelessness that can set in pretty quickly, which it definitely did for me over the years. Still kind of fighting against that sometimes because it just seems so bleak when we are up against, you know, a $70 billion border industry, right? I mean, it can seem so futile to be like writing little books, you know, or even like our little fellowship program, right? But I think it is in this small kind of concerted, grounded action and learning from one another that real change can happen, even if it is small and maybe less sexy than like a sweeping legislation or whatever, because even though, you know, I had some hopes for that, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anyway. So, you know, maybe kind of concentrated smaller action is more important. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think part of it too was about raising awareness, right? And making it, I guess this is the balance with my work, which I'm not even sure if, you know, I get right half the time, but it's like keeping the contextual specificity there and saying, like, we need to care about the border and refugee camps and spaces of exception and, you know, humanitarian emergency, while also drawing these linkages to robo-dogs in New York, right? Because it is about finding ways to talk about this also with people who maybe just are not interested in things, right? Like critical race theory and migration studies and surveillance studies. Like, they will care if a robodog is running around their neighborhood, right? And then how do we then tie that back to what's actually happening at the border? I think there are ways, but we really need to think about how we actually also share our message and find ways to talk about it together.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. I've got another. Yeah, I'll maybe ask another question, but yeah, feel free if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hands. And maybe this kind of, I think this goes back to partly what you were addressing in your response to Josh's question around kind of, I guess, resistance, or, you know, and this sounds like what will be the kind of the subject of your next book. And in terms of that kind of the interconnection between surveillance and AI within border spaces, in the introduction, again, you discuss how there's kind of like a responsibility, how the responsibility over grave errors is dissolving, which I think is totally true. And it really reminded me of Lucy Suchman's work on AI and warfare, where she argues that we're seeing kind of an increased blurring of like chains of accountability as decision-making processes are kind of increasingly algorithmically kind of like automatized. So yeah, I guess maybe this is again pointing towards that future project, but in terms of both resistance to those technologies, but also actually what ways might be developed to kind of actually, I guess, reestablish those chains of accountability, if that makes sense, as they're increasingly kind of black boxed and made kind of intentionally quite opaque. And maybe this is going to, I guess maybe this is part of that second project too. But I'm kind of interested in the ways in which we if surveillance technology is increasingly black boxed, how do we expose that infrastructure?
Yeah, definitely. And it is about this kind of infrastructure of obfuscation in a way, right? This kind of, I mean, dehumanization that's already there, and then somehow that then being tied to automation as the kind of way to rid ourselves of responsibility. It's almost like, well, the computer made me do it. I mean, I'm simplifying it a bit, right? But it's this idea of automation bias. And that's why I find it so interesting too. And sometimes, you know, we talk with policymakers and they're like, what are you so worried about? There's a human in the loop, you know, like, don't worry, they're checking it, right? But that's not really the point, because we know that people are primed to think of, automated decision-making in a different way, as somehow being more plausible, more truthful or more accurate or whatever. And then that inherently informs the way that we make decisions. I mean, again, it goes back to the kind of opacity of decision making in immigration context already, right? Like even before tech is involved, you can have two officers look at the exact same set of evidence and render two completely different yet equally legally valid determinations, right? So when we start augmenting or replacing some of that decision making with automation, what is that doing to our just even our responsibility to be, a fair, transparent decision maker, let alone the responsibility that we have to each other as human beings. And it is, I think, ultimately, it is about dehumanization because it becomes much more convenient when you're looking at somebody from a screen on a drone, right? Whether for warfare applications or for border surveillance applications. This kind of subhumanity just gets amplified through technology. And that's why these dehumanizing narratives, we really have to counter them and not see technology as something neutral, but rather as a lens or a mirror that reflects these kind of predispositions that are already inherent in the way that we make decisions at the border.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that's such an important way to kind of frame the discussion. Absolutely. There's a question from Noura in the chat. So she said, thanks so very much for the talk. I had a question on counter spaces, and thank you, Josh. My question is on methodology and your own positionality that you alluded to at the beginning of the talk. And she says it's a simple question. What languages were the conversations conducted in?
Great question. So it depended on the context. Some were in English, some were in Spanish, some were in Arabic. My own Arabic is enough to open doors, but not enough to conduct a conversation in. So I was working with a close translator that would go with me for all the conversations. It was always the same person. That also kind of played into this relational methodology that we were working with. But actually, predominantly for this book, a lot of them were done in English. That at the choice of the person. I always try and leave it to the person that I'm speaking with or working with to make a determination on how they want to conduct the conversation too.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I mean, maybe a last chance if anybody's got a final question or two, or but if not, I'd really like to thank you, Petra, for the talk and for the discussion as well. It was really great. Really appreciate you taking the time as well. And yeah, I guess if there's no follow-ups, then we can leave it there for today. But thanks everyone, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming on, in the middle of summer to talk about border dystopia and strategies of resistance. I'm really glad that we got a chance to have this conversation.